All right, ladies and gentlemen, before we get to the episode, I want to give you a brief update on one thing, and that is that you are going to hear some new theme music for the podcast. And this music was specifically made for the show by Brent Arehart. I got his name and contact information from Lexi Henning, who those of you who listen probably are familiar with her. She hosts the Ancient Office Hours podcasts and co-hosts the Reading Party podcast. So, Lexi, thank you for getting me in touch with Brent and making this happen. And Brent, thank you so much for making this excellent music. And with that, on to the episode. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Classical Antiquity Sidequest, a podcast covering topics from classical antiquity, the period of time is known for, as Edgar Allan Poe put it, the glory that was Greece, the grandeur that was Rome. Our next side quest will take us into the dangerous time that can be regime change in the Roman Empire. We'll answer a lot of questions, including why were such changes at times associated with violence? Why at other times were they not? And how did the state itself transfer power from ruler A to ruler B? Basically, what happened with the bureaucracy? Also, what was the process by which new emperors were chosen? Who was most at risk during a regime change? And how did the state continue to function when a new ruler takes over or there's a gap in power? To answer those questions, we'll turn to our guide for this next side quest, Dr. Nat Katz from the University of Arizona. He'll walk us through the process of regime change in the empire and the various manners by which new emperors could be chosen and were chosen. He'll educate us about the bureaucracy itself and how it managed to continue to work when new rulers took over. And we'll also discuss the legal framework and lack of official rules regarding who could become an emperor and how emperors were selected, which was kind of fascinating to me. As much as we study emperors and rulers, you would think that there would be some sort of manner or process or clearly designated set of rules by which the imperial family, if you will, was to follow. But it's not the case. And it kind of makes sense if you think about it, because, hey, you have a guy who may have come to power by force. He's not necessarily going to be constrained by some rules. We talk about that, and there's also some It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia references. So I think that you'll enjoy our next episode. And with that out of the way, let's turn to that now. Dr. Nat Katz, how are you, sir?
I'm doing great.
Well, thank you for meeting with me on what had initially been a stress-free, no worry Wednesday before Thanksgiving until the calendar gods got a hold of me. I don't know who that would be in Roman mythology, but I'm glad you were able to still make this work and to come on the podcast. I'm looking forward to this. As you may know, one thing that I like to do for first-time guests is give them a chance to tell us their classics origin story. How did you end up studying the classics?
Yeah, so I think for me, it really came out of my love of stories. So since I was a kid, I've enjoyed both history and also like literature, but especially, the kind of epic fantasy stuff like Game of Thrones. But of course, what is like, Roman history or medieval history, but the most exciting, detailed, epic fantasy story with the bonus that it actually happened and you can, research it and discover new things about it. So yeah, I always really enjoyed history. Always intended to double major in history and something else in college, with history being kind of the fun bonus major. And then sort of belatedly realized, oh, I could actually just do this. I could just try and learn more about the past, share it with students, and yeah.
So tell us a little bit about your main areas of research, what you're working on primarily now.
Yeah, so most of my work has to do with the position of the Roman emperor and kind of how you get that position. And I think about that in two ways. So, first, there's the pragmatic angle. How do you, rather than some other guy, become Roman emperor? And from that comes my research into imperial successions, civil wars, assassinations. And then the other related strand to that is imperial self-representation. Basically, how does the emperor talk about his position? How does he persuade everyone in the Roman Empire that one, there should be an emperor, and two, it should be me and not this other guy? So really like looking into those and yeah, do it with like, looking into ancient accounts of assassinations or the coins emperors make after they take power and see the case they're trying to make for why they should get to rule.
It's interesting what you said about how emperors would talk about how they were bigly great and why they should be rulers as opposed to someone else, which made me think about all the got me back into what you started with about the great stories in history and the mythology of it. I've just started reading Suetonius, so by now, the time that this airs, I'm sure I'll be done with it. But there was a great line that I put on my Blue Sky account as Caesar was quoted before he crossed the Rubicon or embarked on the efforts to engage in a regime change, which we'll talk about, where he says, let us accept this as a sign from the gods and follow where they beckon, in vengeance on our double dealing enemies. The die is cast. That's just a fantastic speech.
Yeah, I think the Roman emperors and other leaders like Caesar were very aware that how people saw these events was going to play a huge part in their success and failure. And so they were, in modern terms, trying to construct a story where them coming to power, perhaps violently, is, doing the will of the gods or overthrowing a tyrant rather than, starting a civil war for personal gain.
Little of column A, little of column B.
Yeah.
One thing though that I thought was very interesting as I was reading the Gallic Wars, I didn't think that the commentaries on the Civil War were as good, but I felt that he was really crafting a narrative to have himself portrayed in a certain way. And it was interesting. And I would have to go back and study this, and someone could listen to this and tell me you're wrong about this. But it felt like early on, Caesar talked about Romans and us and ours. And as it moved on and progressed, and again, I would have to do a word count. This could be totally wrong. So don't take this as gospel. It felt like it started to become people were looking more for Caesar. He was known for his wisdom. And I don't know if that's been studied. Again, I came at the classics later in life, so probably somebody has. But that sort of discussion point seems to align nicely with what you're researching now about how you go from us, our Roman, to me, mine, Julius Caesar.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. I think Caesar is very aware when writing both the Gallic Wars and the Civil Wars about how he's appearing. I mean, there's a theory that I don't think we can 100% prove that I love, but it is that year by year, Caesar finishes the campaigning for that year, writes the corresponding book of the Gallic Wars, sends it back to Rome, and his allies are like reading it on street corners to keep, the story and legend of Caesar alive while he's away. And we can't, I don't know if we can 100% prove that he did it year by year, but I think that really gets at like the spirit of what he's trying to do and how he's trying to cast this story.
Yeah, he is an interesting character, and as Dr. Garish pointed out, he was still a total dirtbag, but still fascinating. Did a lot of bad things that we could talk about for a while, including toppling a republic, which leads in, or what was left of one, leads in nicely to what we're going to talk about today and what I had reached out to you. This kind of sprung from a suggestion from Anthony Caldelis about civil wars and regime changes and what can happen with those and what change they can bring about. And I found your profile for my Duke football and basketball listeners. As you know, there is an Arizona tie-in, so there is a real good sports tie-in for this too. So you should definitely listen, as that's where Dr. Katz teaches. But let's get into regime change in Imperial Rome and something that has no relevance to anything happening today in modern times or in the last 4 years, just none at all. Uh, let's give a little bit of a hypothetical, all right? And we'll lead to it from there. Emperor dies randomly or strangely through an odd set of fortuitous circumstances, he ends up dead. Group of soldiers don't get paid, right? Or family poisons him, whatever. How does the actual transition process work? I mean, when I ask about that because as a kid and maybe through college, when you read about it, you're more thinking about Emperor A, Emperor B, Emperor C, but there's a whole bureaucracy itself that exists alongside that. So how does the actual Roman state itself transition from Emperor A to Emperor B?
Yes, I think the answer to that question is surprisingly fuzzy. And this is one of these weird things about the Roman Empire that I expect we're going to keep coming back to. It doesn't have clear rules of succession. It doesn't have clear rules of, okay, one emperor's gone for good reasons, for bad reasons, who takes over. It doesn't even have clear rules about how you become emperor. And that gap probably goes back to Augustus, who, after all, sets up the empire while claiming he founded or restored the republic. And you can't claim you restored the republic if you also lay down clear succession guidelines, but that's going to be a problem. So, how do you become Roman emperor? Well, it appears like there's three ingredients. The Senate meets and they pass a senatorial decree, which gives you titles like Augustus, and it gives you powers. The people, in the early days, they would pass a law. In the later days, they would acclaim you. So they would just, shout, Emperor so-and-so. And then the military also acclaims you. And in Rome, that's going to mean the Praetorian Guard, so like the emperor's 10,000 plus man bodyguard. So, okay, we've got three components. Which of them is the more important? So far as we can tell, each group probably thought they had the secret sauce, as it were. As in, a senator probably thought, yeah, it's the senatorial decree that matters, and we let the people participate, but that's the moment you become emperor. The military, on the other hand, pretty clearly believes it's that moment of acclamation by the soldiers that matters. So, okay, that would be peacetime or more tumultuous transitions. If the emperor gets, well, murdered, what happens? I kind of break it into two categories. So the first category is what I would think of as an interregnum. And by these, I mean, these come about when an emperor gets assassinated suddenly, and there's a moment when it's not clear who the emperor is going to be, right? Caligula's dead. Who comes next? There's not one immediate obvious answer. That is opposed to something like civil war. So in a civil war, you would have multiple people all claiming to be emperor. So kind of zero emperor problem versus more than one emperor problem. So, okay, how do you pick which one of those guys? Well, in an interregnum, one thing that I've come back to again and again in my research is kind of complicating the overly simple idea, which you'll sometimes see in treatments of this, that go, well, the Praetorians pick because there's a lot of them and they have swords. And yeah, there are a lot of them, they have swords, and it's very clear the Senate can't fight them. And yet, about half the time after assassinations and interregna, you end up with emperors that the Praetorians hate. So clearly something more complicated is going on here, right? If they're picking, why do they keep picking guys they detest? And what I actually suggest is going on is, in an interregnum, in a situation where Caligula or Domitian or Commodus gets murdered, and there's not a clear successor, what matters most is actually not even military force at first, it's speed. What ends up happening is a bandwagoning effect. See, you really want to be the early supporter of the new regime. You really don't want to be the guy who tried to stop the new emperor before he even came to power. So as soon as a viable candidate appears, just about every group in society is going to rally around them. So that means an interregnum is really settled by who can first put forward a candidate. So if the conspirators who killed the previous emperor get their act together, and as soon as he's dead, they show up at the Praetorian camp and they go, here's the new guy, that new guy is almost certain to become emperor. If they're not that organized, yeah, the Praetorians probably end up picking, not because they have the most swords, but because, well, they're just more organized. The few times the Senate tries to pick, they just end up getting deadlocked in debates, and, well, people lose patience and pick. Civil wars, meanwhile, are kind of both messier and simpler in that you have multiple emperors, each is usually backed by a segment of the army, and, well, the army dukes it out.
So then so that's how it succeeds, but does the bureaucracy, as far as the people who administer the provinces and the people who watch the roads and guard the borders, I mean, do they keep functioning, or is it kind of a, oh man, crap, we're in trouble? I mean, I know as you get later into the so-called crisis period of the third century where there's a lot of movement around, but for an empire to last that long, I assume the bureaucracy itself had to be stable to some extent.
Yeah. So the bureaucracy does by and large keep functioning. And I think one of the weird things with Rome is that their bureaucracy is absolutely minuscule compared to ours. Um, the inexact comparison I often make for students is that there are almost certainly more people working for the state of Arizona than worked for the Roman Empire, despite the fact that, the Roman Empire governed a little bit more territory. But it just does so with an absolutely minuscule government by modern standards. So the majority of the government would just continue functioning. One thing that helps with that, if we're talking about an interregnum, so those short periods where there's no clear emperor, those are very fast, right? Somebody is going to come forward as a claimant and people are going to rally around them. So the longest interregnum we know of is only 2 days. A stressful 2 days, but really too fast for things to fall apart. Civil wars, you could end up with more of an issue where you have different parts of the empire fighting each other, for sure.
So oftentimes, so I guess at that point, though, the people in charge of administering the day-to-day functions of government find out, they bend the knee, show their loyalty to whoever takes over. Things just kind of keep on. I mean, I guess I'm wondering kind of intellectually in my head, is it sort of like a who the emperor is kind of affects a sliver at the very top, and then there's everybody else below that it doesn't really have much bearing on?
Yeah. So, all
I know
right.
we're far afield of what I planned, but the side quest is in the title, and now I'm kind of interested here
No, no,
on this diversion.
these are definitely interesting questions. So I guess, okay, a few pieces here, and I guess I'll start with the bureaucracy and then think about like the effect on everybody in a second. So for the bureaucracy, I guess there's really, I'm going to say two big components of it. So the first component, and the people who would do a huge amount of just the day-to-day functioning of the empire, especially in the early empire, so like the first 2 centuries, would be freedmen. So former slaves who are, as the Romans would think of it, part of the emperor's family, and they would do things like be in charge of the emperor's correspondence, our equivalent of like running the budget. So when there's a transition, 99% of the freedmen just pass over without issue to the new emperor. Often the new emperor will make an example out of a freedman or two. So, for instance, when Claudius takes over after Caligula, and Caligula, at least so we're told, was this infamous tyrant who was murdering people. He had this one freedman, Protogenes, who kept two notebooks, one with the title Dagger, one with the title Sword. And allegedly, these were lists of people he and Caligula wanted to kill. So Claudius takes over. Protogenes is publicly executed as, a sign of we're not going to do that. Meanwhile, every single one of Caligula's other freedmen just goes to work for Claudius. So, you might have a high profile, not firing, but execution, but besides that, it's fine. The other aspect of government would be the role aristocrats would play, either equestrians or senators. There, you could definitely have some turnover. So you would initially stay in your post. Let's say the emperor appointed you governor of, Germania Superior. So you're in charge of part of the army on the German border. If there's a regime change, your initial job is just what it was, right? Keep running the army, keep running the province. Now, depending on your new relationship with the new emperor, depending on that emperor's kind of strategy for keeping power, sometimes they'll try and sub people out for loyalists. Other times they figure, look, it's going to be less disruptive if I work with the people who are here. Only occasionally do you get emperors who try and clean house in a bloodier fashion.
Well, sometimes you got to do a spring cleaning. Sometimes you got to crucify a lot of people. It was a different
Yeah.
time. Well, I guess one thing that I remember hearing about a lot through podcasts is that there were very few instances throughout Rome where somebody became emperor who was actually born to the purple, as they say. So I'm just curious, as a general matter, and the one that comes to mind most, where maybe I'm sure Aurelian didn't have enough time to think about who might be his successor, but would the emperors generally kind of have a this is who is going to succeed me if something goes wrong, or do we have enough information to kind of draw or paint a broad brushstroke about that? What I'm getting at is generally would the emperors have a plan in mind if something happened to them and they died?
Yeah, so often the answer is yes. And we do here go back to that thing we talked about earlier, where there's no official rules about the succession. And so it really comes down to the individual emperor. And clearly, some of them just don't think about this, die, and then there's obviously a problem. More often, if you've been emperor for a while, you probably have given some thought to this. There are, say, semi-official ways to designate an heir. I say semi-official just because there's not like one playbook, but most people would understand what you were doing. So over the course of the empire, some ways you could do this that get, I guess, more and more obvious. You start giving your chosen heir responsibilities, political offices. You might adopt them. They can start going by the name Caesar, which by the kind of high and late empire becomes a name for almost junior emperor. So that is something you would do if they're not in your family. You would adopt them into your family. If you are so lucky as to have, an adult male son, inevitably they pick that person as their successor. But you're totally right. They have a terrible track record of their sons actually succeeding them. Uh, yeah, they did very poorly with it to the point where it is a bit baffling. I freely admit, most Roman emperors simply appear to have failed to have adult male children. Either they didn't have male children at all, or unfortunately they pass away naturally or otherwise.
Well, sometimes you die. Well, we all die. Sometimes you just get pushed there a little bit faster by rivals and what have you.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about what could go wrong during one of these transitional periods. Obviously, although these stopped after a while, prescriptions were kind of a thing at a time. Um, the quaint term prescriptions, much like panics for you economists out there. You could also have civil wars. You could have lots of soldiers fighting. But what out kind of how bad could it go, I guess? I mean, could the borders collapse? Could the quote unquote barbarians invade? Mass hysteria, dogs and cats living together? I mean, how bad could it get during one of these transitional periods?
I think the answer depends on what kind of transitional period we're dealing with. So if we're dealing with one of those short interregna, the answer is not that bad. So in the first interregnum, which happens after the death of Caligula, and this is the first time an emperor has been suddenly murdered, and so people really just don't know what's going to happen. There's no precedent for this. The first thing that actually happens that day is Caligula's German bodyguard. So in addition to the Praetorians, emperors would have a smaller bodyguard drawn from German, as the Romans would think of them, barbarians. The idea being these Germans aren't loyal to anyone in Roman politics. And so the German bodyguard's initial reaction to Caligula's death is, we got to figure out who killed him and avenge him. And so they immediately actually kill several senators who they believe to have been involved in the plot. Some were, some weren't. And when Caligula died, he actually had just exited the arena. I think the Circus Maximus, but it might have been a different one. It's not important. He just exited an arena where the people were watching a festival. And so the German bodyguard surround the arena, and they're like, nobody's coming out until we figured out what's going on. Eventually, they do stand down, and that's the end of the violence then. And that is actually the last time during one of these assassinations that there's actually a lot of collateral damage. After that, I think, well, first of all, it's just more important to get that bandwagoning effect going, get everybody on board. And second of all, I think everybody realizes widespread violence is just counterproductive to becoming the next emperor. But what about civil wars? That's where things could get a little rougher. So before the 3rd century crisis, so until the early 3rd century, civil wars definitely got worse than interregna, but there was a ceiling on. And I say that knowing that, a ceiling on the violence is not terribly comforting to the people who are caught in it. But so the first big imperial civil war in 69 CE, this is the year of the four emperors after Nero dies and four people try to replace him. During that war, there is a city in Italy called Cremona that is basically sacked and destroyed in the fighting between two Roman armies. And there is a sort of separatist revolt by this Batavian tribe up by the German border that sees this as their chance to get out from Rome. About 130 years later, when we have the year of the five emperors, so this is after Commodus died, five people try and replace him. We again see some collateral damage, and that's when we start seeing foreign powers more clearly on the outskirts of our picture. So, according to Septimius Severus, who wins that war, one of his rivals, Pescennius Niger, had been diplomatically dealing with Parthia, so the Persian Empire, trying to bring them in on his side. And when Pescennius Niger lost, he tries to flee to Parthia. We should also say here that maybe he actually had negotiations with Parthia, but Parthia does not actually help him in any meaningful way. So clearly in the Civil War, people like Severus are worried about this being an opportunity for Persia to enter Rome, but it doesn't happen. When that really does happen, though, is that third century crisis. So basically between the 230s and the 280s, there are dozens of different Roman emperors. It is a period of nonstop civil war, and this is when really everything else falls apart. By that period, the Persian Empire has transitioned to a new ruling group, so it's the Sassanid Empire, and they are just ransacking Roman provinces like Syria. At one point, they even capture a Roman emperor. Meanwhile, there's other struggles with German quote unquote barbarians across the border. The economy has collapsed. It's a very clear sign during the Civil War of the third century crisis. Cities that haven't bothered to build a wall since the reign of Augustus suddenly say, oh, we need to fix our city walls. It's not safe anymore. So interregnum, not that bad to live through. Civil War in the early empire, bad but not catastrophic, but clearly the third century crisis shows these really can spiral out of control.
Now, the civil wars in the early empire, are those the negative consequences of those, which is kind of a big term, and I get that. Would those negative consequences primarily be rained down upon people at the top of the social order? Would it go all the way down to the bottom? Basically, if you're flying too close to the sun, if you will, are those the people who are at risk, the higher ups?
Yes. So I guess there's a few kinds of violence, right? If you end up getting caught in a city like Cremona that's destroyed in the fighting, there your rank doesn't really matter. But that's not targeted, right? Nobody set out, we're going to destroy the city of Cremona. In terms of people who would get executed by the winning side, there you are really thinking about the people around the emperor. So it could be scapegoated freedmen, like we talked about earlier with Protogenes and his sword and dagger notebooks. But in addition to freedmen, the other people at risk for that sort of thing would indeed have been senators. Now, the Romans don't like it when you start executing senators. And when I say the Romans here, I mean the people who write Roman history for us, who are themselves, of course, senators. So, of course, they don't like it when senators get executed. So in the Year of the Four Emperors, we do see Galba execute some people who he suspected the loyalty of. It's very controversial. People don't like it, but he does it. Where that really starts picking up, Septimius Severus in that Year of the Five Emperors basically says, all right, if you're a senator and you supported one of my opponents, that's treason, you're going to get executed. But he's not like, combing through the streets trying to find ordinary Romans who are maybe quietly rooting for Clodius Albinus or anything.
Okay, so the civil wars, though, that's where in the later empire and the civil wars generally, that's where the greatest risk to the widest swath of society could happen, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So let's kind of unpack that a little bit. Obviously, soldiers on one side, soldiers on the other, those folks are at risk of dying. You can see why they pay me what they pay me. But those soldiers cost money and someone has to pay for those. So are the keepers of the pocketbook, and I know this wasn't on what we had talked about, I'm just thinking about now, but are those folks also at risk for funding the enemy slash, hey, you have a lot of money. It'd be great if you came over to my side now. I mean, do we have any idea about how that worked?
Yeah, so they never, I don't think anybody ever sets out to just truly exterminate the other side. I think Severus's executions of like senatorial supporters are probably the closest somebody comes to that. But well, one, executing the whole other side would be difficult. And two, I mean, if your goal is to become the Roman emperor, executing a bunch of important Romans before you begin just means you're not going to do a terribly good job, right? So if you win a battle, what you really want to do is get the people you just beat on your side. We do, though, have this really weird almost motif that pops up in a lot of histories of civil wars and failed usurpers. And it goes like this. The winning general or emperor enters the defeated usurper's tent and stumbles across a chest of letters. And then he does one of two things. Either he uses those letters to prosecute everybody who wrote letters to the usurper for treason, or he mercifully lights them on fire unread. And I think that really does get at how interconnected and personalized the Roman political world was. So much of like provincial governance would just be kicked over to the emperor by means of, different governors writing him letters. So if you imagine a civil war where suddenly your province has declared for this usurper, well, okay, that's now the guy you're probably going to for just routine matters of governance. And the winner, in theory, probably could take that as evidence that you have, backed the wrong horse and are a traitor. But I think most winners are kind enough, smart enough, have just enough foresight to realize this is a can of worms you probably don't want to open.
I'm going to get the name wrong because I'm bad with names, but when you were talking about the letters that were found, was it Caligula or was it someone else who said, I had these letters and I got rid of them, but psych, here they are. You're in trouble
Caligula is
now.
exactly one of these people. Yeah. So yeah, this is a kind of trope that I've talked a little bit about at the SCS, so like the big annual classes conference, and at some point definitely want to write something on. We don't know exactly what these letters were. I don't think there's ever any source that gives us an example of them, which I would love to know the extent to which when we say letters, we mean explicit treason versus you wrote to the usurper, that's enough to endanger you. But it does show, I guess, the connections beneath a usurpation attempt.
So one thing that is interesting as we're discussing this, and I'm going to come back to Aurelian again, is when he took over or forced his way to the top, whatever terminology you want to use, the empire had fractured. But what kind of cloned itself or twinned itself, to make a really obscure Farscape reference here, is kind of mini Roman states that came into existence, right? And he was kind of tasked with conquering those states and bringing them back into the fold. And I'm just curious if we can draw any insights from that about the governing model of Rome itself, as far as it somehow being stable, despite the fact that you do have these kind of nasty little civil wars that crop up and these unplanned successions and kind of, oh, well, no one was thinking this guy was going to take over, but now he's the emperor.
Yeah, I think these really are a fascinating window into how people throughout the empire think of Rome. And I think what it shows is that people in the Roman Empire really bought into the idea of the Roman Empire. They thought this was a good way, it was a good way to be governed, a good setup. The problem is just at various periods, especially that third century crisis, well, the empire as we actually have it isn't working. But so I think the clearest example of these like breakaway states is the so-called Gallic Empire, which exactly you're saying, it's during this third century crisis, during the reign of Gallienus to one of these incredibly overwhelmed third century emperors who just can't put out all the fires, right? There's issues on the German border, there's issues in the East, there's issues everywhere. And how the issue starts is there's somebody who rebels in Gaul and says, all right, I'm not subservient to Gallienus anymore. But where the story gets weird is this usurper doesn't try and take over the whole empire, right? Normally they would say, I'm going to go march on Rome and try to be emperor. They don't do that. What you end up with is a Gallic empire. So an empire centered on Gaul that includes Britain and Spain. They make no attempt to include Rome, and it's basically Roman Empire 2.0. It's the Roman Empire. It just doesn't happen to include the city of Rome, but the governmental system is set up the exact same way. It's just we changed who the guy at the top is. Clearly, they like the idea of having this emperor, but all right, the actual emperor wasn't addressing our problems. Let's get a closer emperor who will.
So let's there's a lot there, and it explains how long the empire lasted. And I don't know. I don't know as we think about these transitions if there's a good way to kind of think of this, but I'm just curious. Some of these violent transitions that occurred, is there any time that we could look back at it and say, yeah, that was really violent, or it was a civil war and a lot of people died, but there were some ultimate reorganizations or positives that came out of that, to paraphrase Bart from The Simpsons? Other than the American Revolution, World War II, and Star Wars, were there any good Roman Civil War violent regime changes?
I think
Or the aftermath of them, the way they worked out?
yeah. So I think my answer there would be yeah. And I think why these violent regime changes are necessary goes back to another structure, or another way the Roman Empire is structured. So we've talked about how the Roman Empire, like according to Augustus, isn't an empire. It's not a monarchy, even though obviously it is. And so one corollary of this is that you don't have clear rules for succession. Well, another corollary of this is there's no impeachment process. You can't say the emperor's doing a bad job, let's get rid of him. If the emperor's doing a bad job, killing him is the only solution. So in an empire where, frankly, you had a decent number of emperors who were doing a bad job, assassination or civil war really was the only path to something else. So getting concrete, I think we definitely do have some positive ones. The Romans themselves definitely thought that this could lead to positive things. I'm remembering here, there's a quote from the historian Tacitus, the first day after a bad emperor is the best, which I think gets at a lot of the complexities here. On the one hand, yeah, we're so excited to get rid of a bad emperor. It's Tacitus. He always has to be a little cynical. So there's always that like sting in the tail. He's clearly anticipating the new reign is going to decline and get just as bad. But to give you, let's see, one concrete example, I think the transition between Caligula and Claudius would be a great example. Now, modern historians disagree and debate. Was Caligula 100% as bad as the sources say? Maybe he was, maybe they're exaggerating. Either way, I think it's pretty clear Caligula was not doing a good job as emperor, right? Maybe he was not, maybe he was trying to run the empire in a different way, but if he was, it didn't work well. People did not like it. And so I think the shift from Caligula to Claudius did bring a shift in, let's say, I don't know, governmental expertise. With Claudius, it brought more stability, certainly more safety for the people around the imperial court. But yeah, the price for that was assassinating Caligula and the chaos that went with that.
You know, what you said, though, about the first day after a bad emperor is the best, that quote, that does still resonate today because for the people who listen, who know that I'm a sports guy, you will love your team the most, especially if you're a Duke football fan, the day before the season starts. After that, the whole season. I mean, my God, we're recording this after the Virginia Tech game where Duke gave up a 14-point lead to start, almost gave up another 14-point lead and had to hold on at the end. I mean, everybody loves the backup quarterback till they get on the field. But anyway, one thing though that was interesting when you talk about how you can't impeach a bad emperor, and again, this has no modern parallels at all. It's interesting how history just has no bearing on the modern world. Um, it's sort of like you can't prosecute clearly criminal or potentially criminal conduct if it falls within the power core function of the executive branch. But that's completely hypothetical and has no bearing on today. So what you get is more criminal or potentially criminal or corrupt conduct. I mean, but that's all hypothetical, and there's no way to ever see or prove that. Let's talk about examples of transitions that could serve as a model for a good one of what to do in the future, and then a bad one about we don't want to do that again. What was a good one as far that went smooth and well, and what was a bad one that went horrible?
Yeah. So I think Rome offers plenty of examples of both good and bad transitions, with the caveat that when it comes to thinking of what to imitate ourselves, even the best Roman transitions, as we've discussed, are violent because there's just not another way to do it. To start with the transition that went well, let's see. I've talked about Caligula and Claudius being a positive end result, but I've already done that one. We've also already talked about some of the chaos of the transition itself with Caligula's German bodyguard barricading the theater. So I'll think about a different one here. The transition between Domitian and Nerva is, I think, probably the smoothest assassination interregnum combo that we see. So Domitian, at least as our sources talk about them, and of course there's the question about how accurate the sources are, but we'll put that in a box. We can come back to that if we want. As sources talk about, Domitian is a cruel, unpredictable tyrant. My favorite story about that is he threw a dinner party. The senators show up, they're escorted into the banquet room. To their surprise, it's pitch black in there. And they can just kind of make out there's this object they're all sitting next to. And they gradually realize over the course of the night, the object they're sitting next to is a tombstone. And eventually, as you know, a bit of light comes into the room here and there, they realize it's a tombstone with their name on it. And so they're all thinking, oh, we're going to get murdered at the end of this dinner party. Well, no, the night ends. Domitian reveals the tombstone is actually made of silver and is a party favor for them. But the message he's sending, I could kill you all, is pretty clear. So the transition here, there ends up being a conspiracy.
Like some Dennis Reynolds psychopath, like the when the gang gets analyzed. Well, I'll try to remember to put some segment of that in here. That's what that really reminds me of. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, no, you said Dennis Reynolds, and the first thing I thought of was the implication, which I think exactly fits here. Right? Domitian's not outright saying I could kill the Senate if I wanted, but it's really hard to miss that implication.
They're not gonna rise up against me because of the
Yeah.
implication. Oh gosh. Oh, what a
So
great show. Okay.
what ends up happening is a conspiracy. It involves one of the Praetorian prefects. It involves actually Domitian's own wife, and it involves a few senators, including Nerva, the guy who's going to replace Domitian. So Domitian is assassinated. The next day, the Senate, celebrates Nerva as their new emperor, and things are actually relatively peaceful. There are certainly some smatterings of military discontent. The Praetorians, who did appear to like Domitian, pretty savagely punish their own prefect for the prefect's alleged role in this conspiracy. So not everyone's happy. It's not entirely bloodless, but with a minimum of bloodshed, we went between emperors, and Nerva, at least as the sources tell us, was both far better and far less likely to savagely murder the people around him.
I pulled up the quote here that I was thinking of with Dennis, where he's talking to the therapist played by Carrie Kenny, and he says, "It's interesting, our thing, isn't it? To be in someone's mind, to have complete control. It's like the thrill of being near the executioner's switch, knowing that at any moment you could throw it, but knowing you never will. But you could. Never isn't the right word because I could, and I might, and I probably will."
I think there's some Roman emperors who would have really vibed with that quote.
Oh gosh, that whole episode is fantastic. The bottle episodes that they do are usually my favorite. But anyway, so one that went poorly, one that went poorly, and just ended with lots of catastrophe and problems.
Yeah, so I'm going to kind of talk about, I guess we get a 2 or 3 for 1 deal here. I'm going to talk about the year 193 CE that begins with one of these assassinations at Interregna before moving into a full-blown civil war known as the Year of the Five Emperors. It's basically a series of dominoes falling. So we have Commodus, who, again, at least according to our sources, that may be biased, is completely disinterested in running the empire, just wants to shoot ostriches in the arena and be called Hercules. He ends up getting assassinated by a conspiracy, including his freedman Chamberlain, a fellow by the name of Eclectus, as well as his mistress Marcia and the Praetorian prefect Latus. So they assassinate Commodus, and in his place, they pick Pertinax, who is this very experienced senator, actually the son of a freedman. So it's really a rags to riches story. They pick Pertinax. The Senate loves it. The people love it. The Praetorians clearly dislike him from the beginning. And I think a lot of it is as soon as Pertinax is picked, the very end of his first meeting with the Praetorians, he has to pick the new watchword. And the watchword he picks is, "Let us be soldiers," which the Praetorians all take as an insult. Like, oh, like we weren't real soldiers before under Commodus. Now we're going to be soldiers. Oh, you're going to do a bunch of new discipline and restrictions on us. We don't like that. So what happens is in the next 3 months, the Praetorians try and kill Pertinax 3 times. They pull it off the third time. Pertinax is dead. Well, in peak Roman fashion, nobody appears to have thought terribly much about what happens after this point. At the time when Pertinax is dead, it so happens that his father-in-law is in the Praetorian camp. And so his father-in-law is like, well, this is a bad situation, but maybe I can spin this into me becoming emperor. And he starts trying to win over the Praetorians. Meanwhile, another fellow out in Rome, Didius Julianus, one of the richest senators, hears about this and decides to get involved. According to one of our sources that really doesn't like Didius Julianus, he was actually hosting a banquet, and so he was just like lying back drinking on the couch when they hear, and it's his wife and daughter who kind of nudge him into action. So Didius Julianus goes down to the Praetorian camp, and what follows is that basically the Praetorians auction off the Roman Empire. Pertinax's father and Didius Julianus both name increasingly higher amounts of money they will give the Praetorians. Pertinax's father-in-law from within the camp, Didius Julianus standing outside the camp writing the numbers on placards that he and the people with him would hold over his head. Eventually, Didius Julianus says the higher number and becomes emperor. But this is like, the Romans were maybe more okay with violent transitions than we are. Even for them, this is just egregious. And so what happens is there's not
Won't somebody please think of the children?
Yeah, there's not one, there's not two. There are 3 provincial rebellions at the same time, which of course leads to civil war. This is that Year of the Five Emperors I mentioned earlier, where Septimius Severus is ultimately going to win. But I think this really shows, well, the problems with all of your transitions being violent ones. All of our sources agree Commodus was a bad emperor, and Pertinax gets killed quickly, but was actually doing a good job until he died. It's not that Pertinax was a bad emperor. The problem is it's very easy to say, oh, we're going to do just this one piece of violence. We're going to kill this one guy and then rule everything stably. Well, once you start turning to violence, it can get really hard to put that, genie back in the bottle. I think they killed Commodus and the violence just ends up spiraling out of control until there's a gigantic civil war.
If I remember correctly, Pertinax had a lot of things to fix and get done, and nobody likes it when mom and dad come home and say the fun is over, everybody get out of here, right? I mean,
Yeah.
governing is hard and it takes a lot of work, and you often don't. Again, weird, no modern parallels for that. You often don't get credit for doing things that hadn't been done in decades, like building roads, bridges, infrastructure, and what have you.
Yeah, exactly. And I think what you said, the fun is over, really sums up exactly what Pertinax's message to the soldiers was and gets across why they were like, nah, we're going to kill this guy and keep having fun.
Yeah, because there were a lot of monetary issues, right? The treasury was not in good shape. I mean, there was just a lot of things he had to deal with that is problematic and not something that's going to win you a lot of friends because he had to, what was it, from Battlestar Roll the Hard Six or whatever it was that Adama would say. I mean, he had to make those tough calls.
Yeah.
All right, so I was thinking too of an odd transition that did cause some problems was when they just murder Aurelian for no apparent reason.
Oh yeah.
Big misunderstanding. The whole course of human history. Well, I shouldn't say that, but things could have been very different had he not been executed. And one of these days, I'm going to have to do an episode just about Aurelian, but that's a little down the line. Folks, if you are listening, though, do pull up on YouTube The Fall of the Roman Empire with Obi-Wan Kenobi as Marcus Aurelius. You get to see the scene where the Praetorian Guard auctions off the empire. It's good. It's definitely worth watching. All right, so let's try to wrap this up here with a couple other matters. Could you give us a future podcast episode and also a book or a collection of books to read?
Yeah. Um,
Some homework, if you will.
yeah. And when you say future podcast episode, do you mean a future topic for you to talk about or?
Or something that you would either like to come on and discuss again or see someone else come on and discuss. I'm not promising that it will happen, but I will try. However, if you volunteer as tribute, then yes, that's easy to set up. No pressure.
Okay, yeah. Well, one thing that comes to mind, and I don't know if you've already done one of these. If you haven't, definitely a lot to talk about with Roman coins. Both in that.
Have one coming up next
Oh,
week, actually,
okay. Well,
with
awesome.
Dr. is it LeBlanc or LeBlanc at Greensboro.
Okay. Well, perfect. All right. Well, I will look forward to hearing that myself then.
Okay. And if you have thoughts on maybe what I should ask about, feel free to email me or throw those in. I am hoping there's a story of an awesome bank heist that survives, but we'll find out because that would be
Yeah,
awesome.
that would
That's a
be.
movie that could get made. Copyright, trademark, patent pending.
Yeah.
Um, what about some good books to read? It can be from antiquity, it can be anything else. I've gotten a lot of a wide variety of topics from people who've come on of different types of books. Just give us some good books to read.
Yeah. So if we're thinking about like if you're listening to this and you're like, man, I want to think more about well, imperial assassinations or preventing them, there's this book by Rosemary Sheldon called Killing Caesar: Assassination in the Early Empire. It is both detailed but also I think quite accessible. And it is basically a look at the security apparatus and its failings basically from Julius Caesar through Nero. So, like the whole Julio Claudian dynasty. Who's in charge of protecting the emperor? How do they go about doing it? And what goes wrong? So, definitely a good one to check out.
Dr. Katz, thank you so much for taking the time to make an appearance on this podcast. This was very informative, very educational, and it has spurred me to do some additional research and reading and line up some additional guests to maybe discuss some of the particulars of Roman law and Roman legal systems in more detail. I have one lined up, and I'm going to work on a few others, and we'll see where this goes. A lot of this stuff isn't planned, it's just sort of organic, so please be patient with me. But this was a very fascinating topic, and thank you so much for taking time to come on. Now, folks, you know where to find us. Go to our website, bullcitycoordinators.com. We are on Blue Sky and Mastodon at Antiquity Pod. Most of the other socials at Duke FB Coverage. You can find us anywhere you get your podcast, but please like and subscribe over at the YouTube channel. I'm up at about 65 followers now. Not that I'm trying to monetize this, but it would help if we could get that number at or above 300. I do a lot of reading through academia, and I would like to become a premium member, but there's some costs associated with that. And it would be helpful if this podcast could start paying for some of the minimal costs, but costs nonetheless that are associated with the work that I'm doing here. It's a lot of fun. I'll keep doing it either way, but it would be nice if we had some side income coming in from this. No pressure, guys. But anyway, thank you all for listening, and we will keep doing more episodes, regardless of whether we make money off of this or not, because, as you know, the Classical Antiquity Sidequest is a podcast without it.